I want to discuss Keir Starmer's performances in his Prime Minister's questions, his first two PMQs, because we now have a completely clear picture of what the opposition is going to be like for the next 4 to 5 years. Unfortunately, it is exactly as we predicted. Completely toothless, completely weak, basically Tory light. That is what it is. It is not a real opposition party under Mr. Starmer. He is completely and utterly failing to hold the government to account when he has a list longer than my arm of negligent issues that the government is responsible for and is failing to amend, when our NHS workers, our frontline workers, are unnecessarily dying, having their lives taken away from them because of this virus and because the Tories are failing to protect them. I've mentioned many times the failures of this government, but we had, just before the second PMQs, we had a panorama episode that has gone into and exposed even more the gross failure of the government to prepare for this virus. He didn't even bother to bring it up once, which blows the mind when the episode is completely dynamite and shows how the government completely failed to correctly stockpile for the pandemic, so that when it hit this year, there were no gowns, visors, swabs, body bags, etc. in our stockpile, even though NERVTAG, this committee that advises on what items we need in a pandemic, told us last year that we need to get gowns, and the government have failed to do it. They failed to correctly plan. We've had 10 years to fill that stockpile. They didn't bother to fill it with the correct items, and now that we have to use it, it's empty of the stuff that we actually require, which went against the advice received from NERVTAG, from its own advisors, to stockpile, at least in regards to the gowns, where there is evidence that they did warn the government to add it to the stockpile list. And there's even evidence that the government, during this pandemic, has downgraded the requirement for frontline workers to use PPE, not based upon clinical need, but based upon the fact there's a gross shortage of it. How can Starmer not bring all this up in that episode? How can he not mention this when our frontline workers are dying because we've failed to correctly plan and provide PPE to the front line? Starmer also didn't bother to mention that if you look at the number of dead in Britain per capita, so an average in relation to the population size, we have one of the worst in the world. If you include all the ONS data, like the Financial Times analysed, which would include obviously care home deaths and deaths in the community, and if you adjust for the fact a significant proportion of deaths in hospitals are not being correctly recorded as COVID-19, then cautiously a real figure of dead from this virus is probably over 65,000. Now, if that is the case, and if other countries' figures are correct, and of course many won't be, especially outside of Europe for various reasons, but that means that we have potentially the second highest death rate in the globe. Now, do you not think that Starmer should be bringing a bit of this up? There's also all the other problems with the government's response, including the fact that millions of people are left from these furlough and self-employment insurance schemes, such as the hundreds of thousands of new starters or seasonal workers who can't be furloughed, and the hundreds of thousands of self-employed people who are excluded because of the government's completely unfair terms. The completely inadequate universal credit, the failure of the business loans to provide urgent funding where businesses need it, the complete failure to put strings on these bailouts to companies to force them to be restructured in the interests of workers, not in the interests of fat cat shareholders. And all the other problems, like the fact millions of people are skipping meals at this moment in time because they're facing a massive amount of economic hardship, and the government is failing to bail out people, and it's also failing to bail out businesses, but it will shortly be failing out the big businesses in the completely wrong way without any strings attached. And Mr. Starmer is not bringing any of this up or any of it in a significant fashion. Instead, he had the cheek to praise Raab during the PMQs on the government's increase in the testing, even though they're still below the target of 100,000 by the end of April. We're now in May, and it was below 20,000 or around 20,000 for the majority of April. It's only very recently gone up to like 75,000, when testing is a crucial thing for how we get out of this lockdown. Ultimately, Mr. Starmer is not asking the right questions. He's more bothered about this exit strategy when potentially thousands are dying needlessly because of the government's failure to correctly respond to this virus in many ways. And yet Starmer is obsessed with this exit strategy. What that tells people, or what that tells me, is that he's more bothered about courting big business in the city, saying, look boys, I'll get Britain back to work before Boris. That's how much of a Blairite I'm going to be, than actually protecting families and workers on the front line from this deadly disease. Workers should not have to go back to work in this environment where we don't have this mass testing and where we don't have correct provision of PPE and so forth. So of course, Starmer should be urging the government to insure everyone and not leave millions on the scrap heap, where because they are suffering economic hardship, of course they're going to want to go back to work than face living on £400 a month and potentially losing their house or accumulating massive debts and so forth. Obviously they're going to want to do that. But Starmer is not asking the right questions. We do need a roadmap, of course we do, but urgently people need economic insurance immediately. The government is leaving far too many by the wayside. Starmer needs to start bringing that up. And the dire provision of PPE to our frontline workers, that needs to be brought up instead of grovelling at the feet of the government, praising them and failing to highlight these crucial things. Currently, as I don't want to say it, but people on the real left, like me and many others, warned you that he is basically a Tory light. Unfortunately, he doesn't want significant structural change of capitalism. He's not going to provide a real alternative. And now we're seeing it in action. His first month or so as leader of the Labour Party, we are seeing everything that was predicted come true. And the completely cringing, servile, propagandist media lick his ass and tell him that he's done a brilliant job, that he was forensic. Forensic is doublespeak for miss the crucial things. That's what it actually means in the way they use it. Forensic means you're not allowed to discuss the majority of crucial problems except a few very narrow acceptable limits. It's an embarrassment. To call his performances brilliant or methodical or forensic is a total embarrassment.